With question 103 of the Summa Theologica, Prima Pars, we now have entered into the last treatise of Prima Pars. It's 17 questions, which are the treatise on the conservation and government of creatures, 103 through 119. So 17 days from now, we're going to be finished with Prima Pars, and boy, what a celebration that's going to be. Well, question 103 is of the government of things in general, and I just want to say that if you have been following along, and if you've kind of gotten the flow of the Summa so far, you know that really up until now, Thomas has been focused on talking about God, his attributes, the Trinity, and his knowledge, and predestination, and providence, and these kind of things, and also the angels and creation in general, and also, of course, the big section on human nature that we just finished, and Adam and Eve, and paradise, and so really, you should have a pretty good idea of the various creatures, and of course, God being not a creature. And now what he's going to do is he's going to say, okay, now that we understand God's nature and a bit about who God is and what God is, and also the creatures in the world, how does God order it? How does God keep it all under control? And these 8 articles are really interesting, really fascinating. You're going to begin to see the application of what you've already learned to the various ways in which God is going to have governance and order over the world. And so again, there are eight articles. This is going to be a little bit longer, but they're really, really fascinating. Article 1 is whether the world is governed by anyone. Okay, so if it wasn't governed by anyone, then it would just be chaos, and we know that there has to be government. There has to be some kind of order in the world. He says certain ancient philosophers denied the government of the world, saying that all things happen by chance. But such an opinion can be refuted as impossible in 2 ways. First, by, and I love this because this is showing Thomas's classic optimism, his cheerfulness, his just the fact that he sees the world as good. He says, by observation of things themselves, we observe that in nature things happen always or nearly always for the best, which would not be the case unless some sort of providence directed nature towards good as an end, which is to govern. Now compare that to a philosopher like Arthur Schopenhauer, who believed the exact opposite. He thought the world whoever was directing the world was like this evil force, and he focused on all the bad stuff in the world. Or somebody like Voltaire, who wrote a book called Candide, who mocked philosophers who said this is the best possible world. Or Albert Camus, who said everything's just absurd. And so Thomas sets himself apart as an optimist philosopher here. Wherefore the unfailing order we observe in things is a sign of their being governed. For instance, if we enter a well-ordered house, we gather therefrom the intention of him that put it into order. So, again, Thomas sees the world as ordered. He sees the world as good, fundamentally, and that's why this is a great philosophy to learn. Secondly, this is clear from a consideration of divine goodness, as we have said above, which is the cause of the production of things in existence. For as it belongs to the best to produce the best, it is not fitting that the supreme goodness of God should not produce things without giving them their perfection. Now, a thing's ultimate perfection consists in the attainment of the end. Okay, this is teleology. This is things being moved by goodness to goodness. Therefore, it belongs to the divine goodness as it brought things into existence, so to lead them to their end, and this is to govern. So, how cheerful is that? We have a God who is goodness himself, leading good creatures to their good end. Article 2, whether the end of the government of the world is something outside the world. Is the end outside of this world, or is it something to be found here? He says, as the end of a thing corresponds to its beginning, it is not possible to be ignorant of the end of things if we know their beginning. Therefore, since the beginning of all things is something outside the universe, namely God, it is clear from what has been expounded above that we must conclude that the end of all things is some extrinsic good. This can be proved by reason, for it is clear that good has the nature of an end. Therefore, a particular end of anything consists in some particular good, while the universal end of all Next page. Things is the universal good, which is good of itself by virtue of its essence, which is the very essence of goodness. How many times does he say good or goodness in that paragraph? So as Thomas talks about the governance of the world, it's all based on goodness. It's all based on optimism and people achieving their end, which is goodness, which is happiness itself. Article 3, whether the world is governed by one. Okay, are there many things governing the world, or is there just one? We must of necessity say that the world is governed by one. For since the end of the government of the world is that which is essentially good, which is the greatest good, the government of the world must be the best kind of government. Now, the best government is the government by one. The reason of this is that government is nothing but the directing of things governed to the end, which consists in some good, but unity belongs to the idea of goodness, as Boethius proves. Okay, so he's quoting, I don't know if he's quoted Boethius yet in the Summa, probably so, but Boethius was an Italian philosopher who was executed, and while he was awaiting execution, he wrote a really incredible book called The Consolation of Philosophy, which I highly recommend. From this, that is, all things desire good, so do they desire unity, without which they would cease to exist. So he's saying everything's directed by one, for one purpose, which is unity, which is goodness, which is God himself. And I find it also not too surprising, I guess, that Thomas would write a book, I think it was called De Regnum, where he advocated the best form of government is a monarchy, one ruler. So this is very consistent. We have one pope, one leader, and also one God who is ruling all things. Whether the effect of government is one or many, the effect of any action may be judged from its end, because it is by action the attainment of the end is effected. Okay, now the end of the governance of the world is the essential good, to the participation and similarity of which all things tend. Consequently, the effect of the government of the world may be taken in three ways. Okay, so Thomas is always dividing things up, right? First, on the part of the end itself, and in this way there is but one effect, that is assimilation to the supreme good. So imagine all things in the world are being assimilated to the one supreme good, especially the human person being drawn back, exitus, reditus, right? Coming from God, returning to God. Secondly, the effect of the government of the world may be considered on the part of those things by means of which the creature is made like to God. Thus, there are, in general, two effects of the government. For the creature is assimilated to God in two things. First, with regard to this, that God is good, and so the creature becomes like him by being good. Okay, this is virtue ethics. By practicing virtue, by responding to virtue, we become good, so we become like unto God. Secondly, with regard to this, that God is the cause of goodness in others, and so the creature becomes like God in moving others to the good. Wherefore, there are two effects of government, the preservation of things in their goodness and the moving of things to good. Thirdly, we may consider in the individual the effects of the government of the world, and in this way they are without number. There are so many of them. Article 5, whether all things are subject to the divine government. Does anything escape divine government, or is everything included? And he says, for the same reason is God the ruler of things, as he is their cause, because the same gives existence as gives perfection. And this belongs to government. Now God is the cause not indeed only of some particular kind of being, but the whole universal being. Wherefore, as there can be nothing which is not created by God, so there can be nothing which is not subject to his governance. This can also be proved from the nature of the end of government, for a man's government extends over all those things which come under the end of his government. Now the end of the divine government is the divine goodness. Wherefore, as there can be nothing that is not ordered to the divine goodness as its end, it is clear, so as it is impossible for anything to escape the divine government. So if you're beginning to see this here, of course, we know that God has perfect knowledge. He knows all things. We know the perfection of all things pre-exist in God. all things are good by participating in God. Now he governs this entire world without exception as goodness itself, drawing things to himself, assimilating all things. It's kind of hard to get your head around, but it certainly sounds beautiful, doesn't it? Now, Article 6, whether all things are immediately governed by God. Okay, does God use mediators, or does he govern everything directly and immediately? I have a picture here of an angel, because Thomas is going to say, the angels help him. He allows creatures to participate in governance, right? In government, there are two things to be considered: the design of government, which is providence itself, and the execution of the design. As to the design of government, God governs all things immediately, whereas in the execution, he governs some things by means of others. The reason of this is that God is the very essence of goodness, so everything must be attributed to God in its highest degree of goodness. Now, the highest degree of goodness in any practical order, design, or knowledge consists in knowing the individuals acted upon, as the best physician is not the one who can only give his attention to general principles, but who can also consider the least details, and so in other things. Therefore, we must say that God has the design of the government, all things, even the least. So he knows everything that's going on. There's nothing that escapes the knowledge of God, the governance of God, right? But, as we're going to learn in this next paragraph, but since things which are governed should be brought to perfection by government, this government will be so much the better in the degree the things governed are brought to perfection. Now, it is a greater perfection for a thing to be good in itself, and also the cause of goodness in others, than only to be good in itself, right? So to be the cause of other things' goodness is even better than just to be good itself. Therefore, God so governs things that he makes some of them to be causes of others in government, as a master who not only imparts knowledge to his pupils, but gives also the faculty of teaching others. And so we are involved in governance. Okay, we are parents govern their children, teachers govern their students, that kind of thing. Article 7, whether anything can happen outside the order of divine government. He says it is possible for an effect to result outside the order of some particular cause, but not outside the order of the universal cause. The reason is that no effect results outside the order of a particular cause except through some other impending cause, which other cause must itself be reduced to the first universal cause. Let me just kind of explain this. So God is in control of everything. He's the universal cause. He allows some things like us to have free will, which means that we can step outside of his perfect will, but he's always going to bring us back in. Like if we sin, there's going to be discipline. If there's something moves outside the universe, the particular or the universal, well, you can't move outside the universal cause, but there can be particular things that go wrong, but ultimately God's going to bring everything back into order. So in the end, he is always going to win, so to speak. Nothing is going to fall outside the universal cause. Article 8, whether anything can resist the order of divine government. We may consider the order of divine providence in two ways. In general, inasmuch as it proceeds from the governing cause of all. So this is kind of going to be similar to the last article. And in particular, inasmuch as it proceeds from some particular cause which executes the order of divine government. Considered in the first way, nothing can resist the order of divine government, the universal cause. This can be proved in two ways. Firstly, from the fact that the order of the divine government is wholly directed to good, and everything by its own operation and effort tends to good only, for no one acts intending evil, Dionysius said. All right, that's very important. Everything we do, even when we sin, we're trying to achieve some good. So if you imagine every single creature, a snake eats a mouse because it's good, a mouse eats cheese because it's good. Everything in the world is trying to pursue some good. God is ultimately goodness itself. Now, there may be with creatures with free will like us that we choose a lesser good. That's a particular cause. But God is going to bring it back into the universal cause one way or the other. Secondly, from the fact that, as we have said above, every inclination of anything, whether natural or voluntary, is nothing but a kind of impression from the first mover, as the inclination of the arrow towards a fixed point is nothing but an impulse received from the archer. That's an image that Thomas loves to use in the Summa. Wherefore every agent, whether natural or free, attains to its divinely appointed end as though of its own accord. For this reason God is said to order all things sweetly. This raises a lot of questions about predestination, about foreknowledge, about free will, because many times in the Summa, it sounds like we don't really have free will, like God has just kind of got this all under control, and even if we step out of line, he's going to bring us back in. But we have to hold the reality and the existence of free will as part of our nature. So that is the first question, 8 articles of question 103 of the Government of Things in General. We've got, 16 more in Prima Pars and in this treatise. I hope you enjoyed that. Thank you for journeying through the Summa Theologica with me, one question at a time, and we'll be moving on to our next question tomorrow. Thanks for watching. God bless you. St. Thomas Aquinas, pray for us.